our second speaker, who is Katie McKenzie. Katie is a student doctor at the University of Liverpool and will be sharing her experience of developing an eating disorder whilst at medical school. Let me just see if we can see Katie.
Yeah. Here, full screen.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Katie.
Right, so just before I start, there's quite a lot of information on these slides and quite a lot of slides as well, but I'll share them afterwards as what might be able to be a good resource. But basically everything I say is on the slides, so I might not say everything that you can see. So what I'm going to cover is my experience of anorexia and bulimia, types of feelings I had around food, how it affected my daily life, the process of recovery from an eating disorder, reflections on what I wish I knew before having an eating disorder, and then at the end of the presentation, I've just left some resources, websites, and a few extra things that I've thought about, but don't need to mention. So this is just a quick disclaimer. So obviously this is my personal experience, and eating disorders, as you've heard, are very unique. So I'm just talking about my experience, and it's not representative of anybody else or any other eating disorders. And if you think you've got a problem with food and it doesn't match this, that's just because it's me and not you, so not anyone else. And as Max mentioned, if at any point you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to leave. And if you do want any more support or information, this is BEAT. So BEAT is the UK's national eating disorder charity. So this is a free service to anyone. Even if you're not looking for support for yourself, it's a very good website for resources. So they've got lots of information about the different types of eating disorder. They've also got information about supporting someone, which includes tips on how to approach that conversation about an eating disorder. Also language which people with an eating disorder may find triggering. So I will try to answer that question myself later on, but definitely head on to BEAT's website later on as well. And so that's just BEAT's contact details as well, which you can also find if you just Google BEAT UK. And so a little bit about me. So I'm a BEAT ambassador. Basically that just means I've got lived experience of an eating disorder and have gone through the process of recovery. So I started recovery in 2017, and although sometimes I still struggle with some things, I'm working towards full recovery. So as part of that, in summer 2018, I trained as a BEAT ambassador. So as I mentioned, that's just lived experience of an eating disorder, but it's also a really good community of people who have been in similar situations and a reminder of recovery, really. So being able to share the message that an eating disorder isn't something that has to take over your life, and recovering from one is possible. So starting off with just a quick overview of my experience with an eating disorder. Even for me, it's a little confusing, so I hope it makes sense to everyone else. So here we go. So I developed an eating disorder in 2016. So this was during my first year of university. I was diagnosed with anorexia and bulimia. Before this, though, it did take several months to realise something was wrong. Then from there, that same time again, to accept it and feel like I was deserving of help, so felt ill enough. From that GP appointment, I was referred to eating disorder services, but the waiting list times meant that I decided to access private CBT, which is obviously a huge privilege to be able to do that, and I definitely appreciate that fact as well. Within that, I spent around 9 months of working with a CBT therapist to get to a stable place in recovery. Since that, so Max mentioned about the relapse rates and stuff, so recovery is not a stable road. So since that, I've been back to individual CBT to help manage just the ongoing journey, really, and also attended group therapy via the NHS last year. So a little bit about being at university and developing an eating disorder. It was very difficult to manage having both an eating disorder and be your typical uni student, I suppose. So it felt like I was leading a double life because I wanted to keep up with uni, but also I felt like the eating disorder was taking hold, I suppose. At the beginning, I could manage them both together. So I was able to manage work, social life, but once the eating disorder got more ingrained, I suppose, it was very all consuming and it was exhausting to do both. And it felt like I was just watching other people get on with uni and kind of enjoy it and have the like normal uni experience whilst I was kind of trapped with my eating problems. In addition to that, once the eating disorder became kind of familiar to me, it actually provided a sense of stability and familiarity. So those are some of the positive things about an eating disorder, I suppose, that if you never suffered with one, you might not appreciate that it's kind of, in a weird sort of way, it is kind of comforting. And I think it's important to mention as well the fact that mental health and medical school don't have to be two separate things. So as I mentioned, I developed it in 2016. So I suspended my studies in first year because I couldn't balance both together. So at the time I was putting half energy into recovery or half energy into university, and I wasn't going to get to the end of either one successfully if I didn't choose one or the other. It was difficult to feel like I was failing at medical school by suspending, but also failing at my eating disorder by allowing myself to recover. Also, it was difficult to even decide to do that because previously throughout education, everything was about grades, achievement, never that you could have time out if you wanted. And just adding to that, so student support and the medical school wellbeing team supported me with every step. So there is the misconception maybe that you can't struggle with mental health and be a doctor or be at medical school, but it has taught me a lot, which I think will help me in the future, both in terms of just general life and as a clinician. So these are just a few things that I've reflected on. So being able to realise the importance of your own well-being, in that you need to be able to look after yourself, to look after other people. The impact of talking about mental health, in that it is normal to talk about. Everyone has a state of mental health. And when you're in it, it's difficult to think it's just you who may be struggling, but there's often many other people out there as well. And then your current situation isn't the final situation. So as you probably guessed, now I'm back at medical school and in third year. But when I was in that place in first year, I couldn't even imagine. And so I dropped out in April. I couldn't even imagine doing my exam. I dropped out a month before my exam because I couldn't think of the end product, I suppose. So I suppose that's kind of a transformation in mindset. And so this is kind of a timeline of how it developed, I suppose. So growing up, I never really struggled with food or eating, but as per society, there's certain disordered ideas and thoughts that you do pick up on without noticing. Then there was the beginning of anorexia, which I'd say was triggered by probably the stress and change of university alongside other things. Then in response to restriction, there's the onset of bulimia. I then started recovery from bulimia, but as part of that, I had to control what I was eating, and that triggered further restriction. So that led me to fall back into the control and comfort of anorexia. And then in that period from April to September, that was the more intense therapy and recovery. which put me into a more stable place, physically and mentally. So as I mentioned before, there is still certain things that I do struggle with, but that is just part of life, and that's just ongoing until I'm 100% recovered. And recovery is quite a difficult thing to describe if you've never been through it, because the word is kind of, there is an end point and it's a very straight road. But this is just something there. So social media is quite good for eating disorder recovery in terms of being able to see other people's experiences. And this is just one account which articulates the recovery experience really well. So I won't read all of it out, but I think the important things to note is that in the beginning, it doesn't feel rewarding at all. Nobody can see the thought patterns which you're working so hard to change. So to eat something extra like a snack may be nothing to someone else, but that could be the biggest thing you've done all week. And also it is uncomfortable because everything that you're doing is fighting against what you've become used to. But in the end, you do kind of have a realization, I suppose, that there is more to life than an eating disorder, and then recovery is just more of an ongoing thing rather than a kind of battle between the eating disorder and you thinking, is recovery worth it? And this just demonstrates what I mentioned really about the ongoing process of recovery, and that it's not as simple as it seems. So you can fall back into periods of restriction. There's triggering conversations, comments about dieting, weight loss, which you have to manage, anxiety returning around carbs, certain foods. I think something which I found quite strange, I suppose, was going back to therapy, but in a different start position. So for me, it felt more acceptable to go when I was a lower weight and when I was diagnosed at the beginning of anorexia, because that felt like I was better at my eating disorder. But when I went again, I wasn't as unwell, but there were thoughts there which I knew weren't right. So I suppose being able to manage that as well. And then there's just some other things around here, but as I mentioned, I'll send the slides later on. So a little bit about life before an eating disorder. So as I mentioned beforehand, I was pretty naive about the possibility of ever struggling with my mental health. I went pretty much through childhood, adolescence, just focusing on academic achievement, being taught that grades are priority, never struggled with my mental health. Food was just something enjoyable. It was just normal. And I'd only heard about eating disorders from the media. So that was the only knowledge of eating disorders that I had. So the foundations, at the time, all these things seemed very innocent and just things that I could brush off and didn't affect me. But now looking back, these are small thoughts and behaviours which developed, they became deep rooted, and when the perfect storm was kind of put together for my eating disorder, they all came alive, came together, and kind of created the eating disorder. So I think it's just important to mention that because it highlights the impact that comments, conversations, and attitudes around food, weight, and worth can have in the long run. Yeah, so that's just listed some things which could potentially have contributed to an eating disorder. So there's a lot of language about good and bad foods. Diets are often tried throughout adolescence. Sometimes when you start the gym, a lot of the language is focused on weight loss, physical appearance, rather than the other benefits of exercise. A lot of people around you can be congratulated for being thin, so you can grow up thinking that's a sign of success. And growing up, I heard about how people had lost weight or were losing weight. So things like restriction, purging, exercise, and they became almost stored in my head until when I had an eating disorder. So Again, as Max mentioned before, there is a lot of things which can contribute to an eating disorder. This probably isn't even all of it, but I tried to kind of make a mind map of what I could kind of come up with. Um, so there's the social media, diet culture aspects, glamorization of eating disorders in the media, so not portraying them as the serious mental illnesses that they are. Weight loss being seen as an achievement, no education on eating disorders, but then also, I suppose, other things which were personal just to my experience. So kind of black and white thinking, which is attributed to, like, I suppose, academics, so pass or fail. Also thinking about that in terms of food, so good, bad food, perfectionism, um, starting university, um, and then there was the familiarity of the eating disorder, the control, and I suppose the comments on weight loss as well. So as you can see, it's definitely not just one cause. There's a lot of stuff. So development of an eating disorder. So the start of my time with anorexia started just wanting to lose a bit of weight, which is probably something which you might hear a lot, um, but it never started as the weight loss. So there's the aspect of control with a change in environment, workload, and sense of achievement academically. Obviously, university medical school is a lot different to secondary school and college in that you don't have a set amount of things that you can do, and to feel that you can take it off on a to-do list. So that kind of felt like alien, I suppose. So in that way, food and exercise plugged this gap and made it feel like I could be in control of that, and achieve that. Didn't recognise any of the behaviours at the time as being abnormal, but realised something was wrong when I couldn't deviate from it. And it was replaced with feelings of fear, loss of control, failure, and anxiety around everything to do with food. And then the start of my time with bulimia. So when growing up, I just heard about it in conversation, never heard it spoken about outside of the context of losing weight. So none of the negative effects, the negative physical effects, the huge impact that it can have. And the first time it was a one-off, and I never would imagine myself to be affected by it, and did think it just wouldn't happen to me because I wouldn't let myself do that again, I suppose. Um, and I also find out that there is more of a taboo around bulimia because of um, the purging aspect, I suppose, and because of that, it is more difficult to talk about. But that is something that can stop you from getting help, and that keeps you stuck in the eating disorder. So the earlier you feel able to get help, the earlier recovery can begin. So having an eating disorder. So as Max mentioned, the beginning is quite a lot of positive things, I suppose, and it does kind of feel like the honeymoon period. So the effect of restriction and weight loss is intoxicating at first. That does give you an adrenaline rush, and it does feel like a good thing. But then you realize it's more of a toxic relationship in that the thoughts are there all of the time, and even though they are negative thoughts and behaviors, they're portrayed in something that will be in your best interest, but obviously in the long run it's not. But during this earlier period, there was feelings of being in control, achievement if I ate less than other people, the kind of congratulatory response from the eating disorder voice, elation of weight loss, feeling powerful if I restricted, and ultimately a fear of losing my eating disorder in that I didn't want to let it go. So a little about how it can be and how it was maintained. So at the start, comments about weight loss were more comments of congratulations, but by the time they were comments of concern, the amount of weight I'd lost and way I felt about it made me feel driven to continue. And I suppose the eating disorder was kind of making it seem like people were jealous of the weight loss because there is that kind of idea in society that weight loss is a good thing. So even though I definitely don't think that when I had an eating disorder, that's kind of the toxic thoughts that it can make you think. Also, a huge thing is feeling like you're not unwell. And so being told that I wasn't well made me think, well, I'm going to actually have to be unwell then. If people are going to be concerned, then I needed to try harder at my eating disorder. So continuing with behaviours such as restriction and exercise are almost actively celebrated in society. So even when I felt like something was wrong, I could go on social media and see a lot of like exercise posts, new rules on food, associating calories to being able to do certain exercise, stuff like that. So it's difficult to find reasons to recover in a society which is focused on diet culture and weight loss, and that is only accentuated by the eating disorder voice. A huge thing about an eating disorder is missing out on normal life. So the anorexia kind of promises you that you could change back whenever you want to, but whenever you try to, you realize the grip and control that it has. So despite it sometimes being thought of just about food, it affects basically every aspect of your life. So just a few things here. So avoiding food as much as I could, which included social situations. So I didn't like eating around other people, eating at different times, didn't feel comfortable eating in different places, constantly thinking about food or worrying about food. So as you can see, that basically affects being able to spend time with your friends, family, enjoy birthdays, Christmases, just kind of have the flexibility that you would want as part of a normal life. So this is just a quick diagram here, I suppose, just to show how it could develop, and that the dieting and weight loss can change your brain basically, and lead to some of the characteristics of anorexia. So the denial of having a problem, of having anorexia, the rigidity around food, around weight, the obsessionality around food and weight as well. And ultimately, if you're restricting your foods, you're also restricting your life and what you can do, I suppose. So it can result in anxiety and depression as well. So transformation into bulimia. So restricting basically put my body into starvation, and so it was in an energy deficit. And after a long period of restriction, I suppose having one higher calorie thing almost shocked my body. That is something that I'd not let myself have for such a long time. So it was kind of a period of not knowing when I get it again. So an impulse to eat more of it. In the way anorexia gave me a high by having control around food, the bulimia sort of teased me by making me feel like I was able to let go of anorexia, seemingly enjoying it at first, but then it spirals out of control. So it was just replaced with guilt, shame, and disgust. And obviously those are quite like harsh words, I suppose, but that is the kind of emotion that you can feel towards food and towards yourself for eating food. And in response to that was the impulse of making myself sick. So purging, which gave an instant release of guilt and the sense of control back. So I think this is just quite a good diagram to show the constant conflicting messages and thoughts that you can have when you have bulimia or an eating disorder or any disordered relationship with food, I suppose. And in the case of bulimia, it's exacerbated by the energy deficit, irregularity of eating, and the extremes of purging, in that your brain really doesn't know what's going on, and neither does your body. It's just a bit of a mismatch between it all. So a big thing about bulimia is the secrecy of it. So it's more associated with being a normal weight, in quotation marks. The physical sign of weight loss and lower BMI isn't always there, so it's an easier eating disorder to hide and sustain in that way. The comments of concern, which you may get with anorexia, aren't always there, so less incentive to get help. In that way, it's easier to convince yourself there isn't an issue, because you may be able to eat as you would expect normally day to day, but still engage in bulimic behaviour. And unlike anorexia, which is some behaviours which are celebrated in society, bulimia isn't spoken about as much. And so the eating disorder paradox is that you lose control by being in control. So this is just a summary slide more than anything really, just showing that at the beginning, the honeymoon period, all the positives of an eating disorder soon become being out of control, not being in power, and being driven by your eating disorder. Accepting an eating disorder. So it's very difficult to accept it first in terms of the fact that it's easier to convince yourself that you're not ill enough rather than to convince yourself that you are. I suppose because there is the idea in society of some people with eating disorders are very thin. So I always thought there's people much thinner than me who deserved the help, I suppose, that it wouldn't be taken seriously. Also kind of thinking I couldn't have an eating disorder because I was always thinking about food, and people with eating disorders don't like food. But that is also a misconception too, because despite maybe not eating food all of the time, if you have an eating disorder, you're thinking about it, pretty obsessed with it. I've read things about people like reading recipe books, watching cooking shows, kind of anything they can do to get involved with food without having to eat it themselves. So being told I had an eating disorder, instead of being a kind of trigger to get better, at that point it felt more like a congratulations, and that it was part of my identity. And in terms of the kind of perfectionism aspect, if I now had anorexia, I felt like I needed to be good at that as well. And something really unique about anorexia is that, unlike any other illness, you want to be the sickest. So seeing other people with an eating disorder actually makes you feel that you need to eat less, exercise more, and sort of be better at your eating disorder. And in that way, there is the spiral of weight loss, in that being told you've lost weight can actually serve as a form of congratulations rather than of concern. So living with an eating disorder. So I think an important thing is getting a diagnosis doesn't mean that automatically any of your thought processes will change. So even though I was advised to gain weight from GP, uni, family and therapist, and I might have looked like I agreed from the outside, the motive was still weight loss. I still just thought about restriction and weight loss all of the time. Didn't want to gain weight, didn't want to follow advice of the GP, because it felt like they were just trying to sabotage the eating disorder because they didn't understand it. And when you're in that place, you kind of think that everyone is just trying to get rid of the eating disorder because they don't see the positive bits to it that you do. So I suppose in the height of it, majority of the time kind of viewed the world through the eyes of anorexia. Sometimes, which was during the process of recovery, I suppose my real personality still broke through. So I was able to see the concern of people, see my own weight loss, realise the impact that it was having on my whole life, basically. And that was actually quite a scary feeling when I realised how deep into this I had gotten, because something that started so much like a honeymoon period had become something so toxic and scary and quite overwhelming, and feeling of being trapped. And in that time, I couldn't really remember a point where I didn't feel that way about food or weight. So when you are in the midst of it, it's difficult to kind of see a way out. And in that way, there was a period of not wanting to get better. So the rules and rituals of an eating disorder were like second nature. It's felt more difficult to recover than it was to sustain my eating disorder, because the things which recovery offered weren't the same as weight loss. In that weight loss is seen by other people, I suppose. And as that quote mentioned before, recovery is very much an invisible battle that you have to face. So an eating disorder is obviously a huge thing in changing your personality, because it kind of takes over your life. And in the time of being unwell, seeing people worried about me actually fueled the eating disorder behaviours. But that is ultimately because when your brain and body is malnourished, the rationality and understanding is gone. So some ways that I suppose I recognised how I changed. I became more withdrawn from conversations, unable to concentrate on uni, thinking about food at every opportunity, having more of a short temper around my family. And in that respect, when they were trying to help me, that's when I got the most annoyed, I suppose. So obviously that wasn't me, that was the eating disorder not wanting to be helped. And just so before, how I mentioned how it changes what normal life is like. It was easy to feel isolated because I only let myself do things which fit in with the eating disorder. So recovery is a process which is allowed by having that insight into the rational versus irrational thoughts. I think the most difficult thing about an eating disorder is that food's everywhere all of the time. So it's not something that you just have to do once a week. You have to do it several times a day. And it's also something which seems effortless to other people, or you can think it seems effortless, and you have to push through, really. And especially it's difficult to ignore comments that people may have about their own relationship with food, because obviously it is a completely unique and individual thing. So someone else can talk about dieting, weight loss, and bad food, and it cannot affect them at all. But I think just something that I found particularly triggering in recovery was maybe if I was trying to push myself for a meal and then I heard those sort of comments, it made it kind of 100 times worse, like rubbing salt in a wound, I suppose. So as I mentioned, I saw a CBT therapist. So this was found on Beat's website and really helped to bring back the rational brain and distance myself from the eating disorder voice. So this just involved months of weekly appointments. I spent many days just filling out food diaries, having to write how I felt about eating, what I'd eaten. There was weekly weigh-ins. So in the past, where if I'd lost weight, it would have been, I suppose, an internal and celebration. I couldn't get away with restricting anymore. And this made me realise that it was only me that had control of the eating disorder. So it was my responsibility. And I could have all the help from friends, family, therapist, GP, but at the end of the day, no one else can do it for you. So that's just a bit about challenging the eating disorder. So probably as I've gone through the talk, I've mentioned the eating disorder voice. It doesn't mean that I heard another voice. It just means that it's helpful to name it as a separate thought process so that you can distance it from yourself. And in that respect, there were some sessions where I would speak words that didn't feel like my own, describing how I felt about food and weight. And it was at that point where I realised that's not how I would usually think, that I suppose I was able to start identifying the eating disorder thoughts from my own. Just quickly, so the aftermath of an eating disorder. So as I was able to identify thoughts as irrational, the therapy sessions decreased, I was able to gain more independence. It felt like a rush to be free and to have so much out there, which I'd now had access to. But also it was quite confusing and overwhelming because for so long I'd not fueled my brain, fueled myself, and now it had so much energy, so much going on. And it's just important to remember that your body recovers before your mind, and mental recovery is delayed. So just because someone looks better doesn't mean that they are. So that's just the reality of recovery. So I kind of mentioned that before, that it's not a straight road. So each day can be different, and some days more challenging than others. So I suppose that's just important to remember in terms of, if you have an eating disorder, know someone with an eating disorder, or are supporting someone, just be aware that it is an ongoing thing. So finally, just what I wish I knew before. First and foremost, you don't want an eating disorder. So growing up, the only time I'd heard about them was in the media and talked about as positive things, not as a serious mental illness, as they are. Thinking you are unwell is a sign that you are in fact unwell, and it's important to get help and support as soon as you can. Recovery isn't an easy process, and you don't lose the attraction to an eating disorder, so you have to continuously remind yourself and challenge yourself. Your body recovers faster than your mind, and it's not a quick or easy process, but in the long run, it is worth it. And people will still talk about diets, weight loss, things like that, but you just have to try and block it out, because everyone's experience is completely different, and you yourself, if you've had an eating disorder, can't afford to go back to an eating disorder just because someone else is trying to diet. And so these are just some resources and support services. So obviously Beat is the website, which has a lot of these services on. So I just think it's important to mention, if you do think you have an eating disorder, or if you think someone close to you may do, then these are just some tips that I have, I suppose. Especially, I think, being able to write it down beforehand to try and explain how you're feeling around food, weight, exercise, how it's impacting you, makes it a lot easier to try and explain to someone else. And I suppose final message, that it is a lot to manage on your own. So the first thing is to find people you trust and share the burden of the eating disorder with. Even if it's one person, it makes a huge difference. And that is often the hardest thing to do, but it's also the biggest step forward to recovery. And these are just some books about eating disorders, if anyone had any extra interest or wanted to know more about it. Obviously I'm sending the slides, so that will be available on there too. And that is the end. Sorry it was quite long, but that's done.
That was brilliant, Katie. Thank you so much for doing for coming along and speaking about this this evening. And your slides were so detailed and took us through so many different kind of thoughts and feelings. It's clear that you've had you've reflected a lot on what's happened, and it's so useful to hear your perspective from kind of every angle, really. So I really, really appreciate you coming and talking about that. And I'm sure everyone in the audience who stayed to listen feels the same way. I guess I wanted to start off by asking you the same question that we kind of finished with Max on, which was just generally if you feel like there are things which are right and wrong to say, or if there are things that you should avoid. I know it's obviously difficult to generalize, but in your own situation, how would you tackle people who want to feel kind of comfortable talking to yourself about what's happened?
So I suppose the first thing to say is that if someone starts a conversation with you about an eating disorder, then that is automatically a huge level of respect to them for probably starting that conversation. And if someone is going to speak to you about it, then don't really be scared of saying something wrong, because if you have, I suppose, speaking in a place of recovery, I respect the person for speaking to me. Maybe if I was unwell, then it could be more triggering. So maybe just don't mention maybe like specific things that you've noticed in terms of maybe the current intake behaviors, stuff like that, but approach it as more of an overview of what you're worried about, maybe. Um, but I agree with Max definitely about. I know it is supposed to be a nice thing, but saying that you look well is probably my worst nightmare. So yeah, I think that's just a generic thing.
Yeah, no, that's really useful to hear. I guess it's a slightly odd statement to make to anybody, but I can totally see how that might come across. The other thing I was kind of curious to ask you about was how you felt. Obviously, you started this journey in 2016 when you started at uni. I don't know if you were able to kind of evaluate what elements of the experience might have cultivated this experience for you. So was it the just the kind of moving away from home, or was it specifically things to do with the medical school environment that kind of created this feeling of lack of control?
Um, I suppose it's probably a mixture of a lot of things. So there's probably things that I've still not even thought about, and little things which can kind of add up together. But I suppose the reason why it happened at that time was probably the impact of medical school, alongside uni, moving away. Um, so I lived with a lot of people who weren't doing medicine. So the fact that they could just kind of enjoy everything to do with uni and do the course, I suppose I felt a little out of depth in that way. And I suppose food and exercise was kind of something that I could control, but also still do uni at the same time. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, definitely. Yeah, I suppose being around other people who are not in such a high pressure environment immediately must have been quite a difficult thing to deal with. I can totally see that. Um, if there's any other questions in the audience, feel free to ask. But if not, I was going to ask you just kind of finally. You've obviously given us this amazing presentation and taken us through so many different um, kind of parts and thoughts and feelings that you had. How long did it take you to get to feel so sort of seemingly so comfortable about talking about this and being such a great speaker, and obviously you're a Beat ambassador. How long did that process kind of take you of reflection and recovery, and now you're at the point where you're able to go through all that and um, talk so well about what's happened?
so I suppose I kind of thought because part of what made me struggle was that I didn't know anything about eating disorders. So that when I first kind of felt something wasn't right, I didn't know what it was, and I didn't have anyone else's experience to compare it to, I suppose. So it was when I'd gone through the more intense part of recovery. So where I wasn't at uni, but I was still having therapy, that built foundations of kind of really understanding what had gone on. And then I suppose when I had my year out, I had a bit of extra time, knew the work that Beat did, and kind of just wanted to get involved in some sort of way. Um, yeah, I think.